Assalamu alaikum, inshallah you're well guys. So today I'm going to speak about practical work experience, and you guys know that it's not just about passing your exams to becoming a chartered accountant. That's just one of the requirements. The other two being passing the ethics, skills or professional development requirements and practical work experience. And each chartered accountancy body will have their own requirements. For example, the ICAEW and ICAS bodies require 450 days of relevant work experience, whereas the ACCA and CIMA bodies require 36 months. There is a slight difference if you're a school leaver studying for the ICAS qualification. In that instance, you would require 750 days because the contract for apprentices is around 5 years compared to a 3-year graduate contract. Now, it's not something I agree with because I don't see the difference between a school leaver who's just completed their A-levels or BTEC qualification and someone who's graduated from university in an unrelated subject. They're both the same in my eyes. So I don't get why a school leaver would need 750 days of work experience, whereas a graduate would need 450 days. But as I said before, guys, a school leaver contract is 5 years. So inshallah, that should be more than enough to build up that relevant work experience. And it's only with the ICAS qualification. Doesn't apply to the ICAW. And to be honest with you, in my 10 years of working in the industry, I have not yet seen any apprenticeship offering the ICAS qualification. This probably doesn't impact many people at all. Now, at this stage, some of you may be thinking that because the ICAW and ICAS qualification, if you're a graduate, requires only 450 days worth of work experience, that's about 1.5 years. So why don't I go and study those rather than going for the ACCA or CIMA qualification, which require 36 months? However, you've got to bear in mind that the ICAW and ICAS bodies only accept relevant work experience. So things such as weekends don't count. So if you take a year, there's 365 days in a year, and you take out all the weekends and public bank holidays, you're left with around 240 working days. And of those days, you're obviously going to take some annual leave, around 20 to 25 days. So say you're left with 220 days. Then of those 220 days, you may spend between 6 to 10 weeks in college. That's another 50 days lost, say around 170 days left. And then of that, you may spend 10 to 15 days in training, which doesn't count as relevant work experience. So actually, you can get a maximum of around 150 to 160 days anyway, which will take you around 3 years to complete the 450 days requirement. With ACCA and CIMA, relevant work experience doesn't come into it. Instead, they require 36 months experience in a finance-related role. So actually, when you compare the 4 qualifications, it will take around the same time to build up the relevant work experience requirement. At this stage, you may be thinking it's easier to build up the relevant experience with ACCA and CIMA because you just have to work in a finance-related role. However, you have to meet certain objectives, and those objectives have to be verified by your line manager. And these objectives cover a wide range of areas in finance, including management accounting, financial accounting, tax, internal control. If you've studied for the ACCA, you can also meet an objective for audit and assurance. However, that's not applicable to CIMA. And the reason why is because CIMA doesn't cover audit. One thing to bear in mind, guys, is that you must build your practical work experience at a firm which is registered with the relevant accountancy body. So if you want to gain the ACA qualification, make sure that the firm that you're working with is registered with the ICAW. And for those of you who have studied for the AAT qualification, don't worry, you can carry over some of your practical work experience to meet the Chartered Accountancy's body's requirements. I'd recommend going on each individual body's website to check the requirements. But I know ACCA accept AAT experience, and with the ICAW, you can do what's known as the AAT ACA Fast Track, which means you only require 300 additional days of practical work experience. Once you're building up this work experience, you have to get it verified. Now, each body will have its own requirements. For example, with the CIMA qualification, I think they require at least 2 managers to verify all of your experience. With ICAW, you can update your training file, or they recommend you update your training file at least every 6 months where you get your experience signed off. And with the ACCA, you have to get your experience signed off by a competent individual who will normally be your line manager. I remember I signed off someone's ACCA experience quite recently, and for that, I had to submit my membership certificate and explain a bit about my role to show that I was competent and appropriately senior to sign off their experience. Now you've got an overview of the practical work experience requirements, build it up at a registered training firm, get either 450 days or 36 months, and get that experience verified by your line manager. But some of you may be thinking at this stage, hold on a minute, with the ICAW or ICAS qualifications, how do you verify what is relevant work experience? Now, mostly practice firms offer the ICAW or ICAS qualifications, and the answer is they will verify your work experience via timesheets. Timesheets are probably the most annoying admin task that you'll have to do whilst you're working in practice. It's something I didn't particularly like, but it's a way of recording your hours that you've worked against particular projects. Although they're mostly used in practice, they can also be used in industry. So for example, in my current team, we do use timesheets to monitor hours worked against a particular project. But honestly, guys, there's been loads of times where I'm sat there on a Friday afternoon thinking, what should I allocate my time to? What was I doing on a Monday afternoon? One tip to help you guys is that make sure you fill in your calendar on Outlook. So when you've completed a particular task, go into your calendar and block out that time against that particular project. Leave a few notes so it will help jog your memory when you're completing your timesheets. But that will then mean that when you're filling in your timesheet, instead of having to think, oh, what was I doing? You can just quickly pop up your calendar and fill in accordingly. And timesheets, like I said before, are really applicable for the ICAW and ICAS qualifications, not so much for ACCA and CIMA, because you have to talk about how you've met particular objectives. They're going to focus more on the write-up and the comments from your line manager. Although timesheets are annoying and they do take a lot of time to fill in, they do serve an important purpose. Practice firms will use this to budget, they'll use it to charge clients, and they'll also use it to agree any overruns. So this is where, as part of a project, you've done some extra work which wasn't part of the original quote, and then you'll run a report of your timesheets to see how much time was allocated to those extra work, and then you will charge your client accordingly. When I was studying for the ICAW, every 6 months or so, we would run a report of my timesheets for the previous 6 months, and then I would divide by either 7.5 or 8 hours to work out the number of days of relevant work experience that I built up. Obviously, guys, remember what I said at the beginning, only relevant work experience will be counted. So anything such as days off, holidays, sick leave, training, which doesn't count, would be excluded. So it's very important you record all of your hours worked, because honestly, guys, I've seen it where people will get to the end of their 3-year training contract and they won't be able to submit their file because they passed all their exams, but they still haven't built up the 450 days work experience requirement. They have to wait a few months, and that delays their promotion to audit principal or audit senior. Timesheets are also used to assess recovery, which is basically a measure of how much profit or percentage profit a firm has made on a particular job. And seniors, managers, and senior managers, they will be monitored on their recovery. The recovery figure or percentage will contribute in some part to their performance rating. So as a junior, you may feel under pressure from your manager or senior manager to understate the hours that you've worked on that job. If you face that pressure in that situation, I'd advise you to have an honest chat with your manager, explain to them that it's important you record your hours, not only for your training contract and make sure that you're building up that work experience, but also so that we budget the job accordingly and appropriately charge the client. Because at the end of the day, forget them. I'd always look after number one. Make sure you're recording your hours accurately. Final point I want to talk about, guys, which is very important because I didn't know about this whilst I was studying for the ACA. I only found out once I handed in my resignation at BDO, and that is if you study for the ACA, ACCA, or ICAS qualifications, you can get an additional qualification known as the Audit Qualification. This doesn't apply to CIMA, guys, because CIMA, as I mentioned before, don't teach audit. And some of you may be thinking at this stage, hold on a minute, I want to leave audit first chance I get. Why would I want this audit qualification? And I appreciate that you may not want to work in audit. However, it's good to keep your options open. Now, 2 years ago, if you had said to me, Fazan, you're going to be starting your own YouTube channel, I would have probably laughed in your face. No, I'm not. Yet here we are. The audit qualification is one of the requirements to become what's known as a responsible individual. And if you're a responsible individual, that means that you can sign off on audit reports. You can essentially charge clients for audits. Now, if you want to open up your own practice and you want to offer audit as one of the services, you must have a responsible individual who's authorized to sign off on reports. So if that's your end goal, definitely get this qualification. Again, guys, different bodies will have different requirements. So with the ICAW, they will require 240 days worth of audit experience, and half of that must be statutory audit, i.e. those under the Companies Act. Similarly, with the ACCA, I think they require around 1,500. hours, which works out to 240 days anyway. And again, half of that must be with statutory audits under the Companies Act. Now, I've left practice. I don't have any intention to return in the short term. But you know what, guys? It still would have been a nice qualification to have, because you never know what may happen in the future. And from an ICAW perspective, and I'm sure it will be similar with the other accountancy bodies, if you haven't built up 240 days audit experience by the time you've completed the practical work experience requirement, and that may be because you spent part of your training contract in audit, part of it in tax, part of it in another area, that's fine. You can bank the number of days, i.e. a savings pot. And then once you've completed the remainder of the 240 days requirement, once you've qualified as a chartered accountant, you can then apply for the audit qualification. But there's one thing to bear in mind. In your training file, you'll have an audit experience section. So when you're recording your practical work experience, make sure any audit specific work is also recorded in your audit experience section. Because if you don't do that and you submit your training file to become a chartered accountant, you've lost out on all of that experience. It's not been recorded and verified separately. So that means that if you become a chartered accountant and you think, you know what, I've been in audit for a while, let me get the audit qualification, but you didn't record it in the audit experience section of your training file, you have to start from scratch. You have to build 240 days experience from scratch. But like I mentioned, guys, that's for the ICAW. If you're with another body, go and check their requirements on the respective website. I'm going to leave it there, guys. Hopefully I've answered some concerns or questions you may have had around the practical work experience requirement. If you have any questions or queries, please feel free to comment below or message me on Instagram.